Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm joined by a real towering figure in national security discussions in Washington and globally, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, co-founder and managing partner of WestExec, and the co-founder of the Center for New American Security, Michèle Flournoy. Michèle, terrific having you.
It's great to be back, Mike.
You've been on before, but I'm guessing there are some people who are not veterans of the podcast who want to know your story. So how did you end up in this national security business, the Pentagon? I know you took, I guess, as I understand it, sort of the think tank academic route, but tell us about how you got here and did you prepare for it or was it an accident?
Probably a little bit of both. So I came out of grad school at the height of the Cold War and nuclear saber rattling between Reagan and Gorbachev. So I started out focused on how do we reduce the nuclear danger, nuclear arms control, nonproliferation. That was sort of what I worked on for probably the first 10 years of my career in think tanks in Washington and then at the Kennedy School, what was then the Belfer Center, or is now the Belfer Center. Bill Clinton was elected. I really hadn't been involved in politics, but several of my bosses and mentors were going into the administration. And I got a couple of great offers to come along and get on the bus to Washington and join the new administration. At that point, I got great advice, which was choose the boss, not the job. So I turned down the perfect job description to go with a boss who was just an incredible mentor, and that was Assistant Secretary Ted Warner, who's no longer with us, God bless him, but he was an amazing, amazing mentor, and I helped him and David Ochmanek at the time reestablish the strategy office in the Pentagon, and that's how I started broadening into defense strategy more broadly.
That's when I would have first met you, I think, because I took a job with Kurt Campbell and Joe Nye doing Asia, same administration, and I didn't have the choice. I took the job I could get, but luckily I had the bosses. I had the bosses that you'd want. I remember in 2016, I was at Georgetown, and when the first Trump election happened, a lot of students who'd been applying to foreign service or thinking about careers in government had a bit of a panic, and said, "Professor, is there still going to be an American foreign policy?" And I said, "Of course." We're at that kind of inflection point once again. Any advice for people who would be, more in the internationalist strain, who were looking at careers in government? My assumption is you're going to say we'll get past this, and actually there will be quite a bit of foreign policy and defense work to do. But what are your thoughts on this inflection point for people starting in their careers?
I do think this too shall pass. I do think that, American foreign policy does, there's a bit of a pendulum swing that goes on between administrations, but you have to take the longer view. And if not this administration, there will be future administrations that I think come back towards the center and towards the sort of more internationalist norm. And so I think the key question is, when you're not in government, how are you going to serve? And there are lots of ways to serve outside of government, to shape the debate, to build intellectual capital for the future, to influence decision makers, to elevate debate. There are just lots of ways to contribute, even in those periods where you can't serve in government.
I have to say, I was out of government in 2016, 17, and at CSIS in Georgetown. I felt like my out-of-government experience might have been more influential in those years than in more normal administrations. There's almost an inverse relationship between how functional the government is and how much help they need. And there were a lot of people within the NSC, the Pentagon, State Department, reaching out for help. There were hard problems, and the majority of people going in wanted to solve those problems. And that's what I want to do with you today, Michèle, is unpack some of the strategic conundrum that, are left over from the Biden administration in the Indo-Pacific with strategic competition, deterrence, and reassurance, and start unpacking those. Because I think, as you know, in any transition, there's a lot of rhetoric. You come in, most people come in thinking they're going to govern the way they campaign, and that doesn't work. So they have some problems to solve. And there are some people who are, I think, going to really aim to solve them. Ivan Kapanathi, the job I had at NSC on Asia, Mike Walsh, the National Security Advisor, and others. So let's look at this as a problem-solving exercise and look at the problems left over. Maybe I'd start by asking you, what's your overall sense of the state of U.S.-China strategic competition and peace and stability in Asia?
Well, I think the competition is intensifying and will continue to do so. And we are truly experiencing it across all of the dimensions: military, technological, economic, diplomatic, informational. And I just think we are on this trajectory, and it's based on fundamental differences. Obviously, we have areas of common interest where we should be trying to work together. But I think the real name of the game here is, how do we compete effectively and maintain, protect, and advance U.S. interests and values while at the same time avoiding conflict with China? That, to me, is the name of the game.
So let's break down some of that. Deterrence. What is your sense of the state of deterrence in Asia right now? Are we on a steady state? Are we losing ground? Should we be worried about deterrence? Do you see steps where we're regaining it? Where do you sit? And you and I talked a lot about this in Australia when you were here. Where do you think we are on maintaining or even enhancing deterrence on the big problems, Taiwan in particular?
Yeah, I think deterrence right now is resting on what I would call reputational deterrence, that China knows that we have the best, most lethal, most experienced, combat-hardened military in the world. I think Xi knows, particularly after these corruption scandals, that his military has still got a lot of work to do. And I also think they're waiting to see how President Trump will behave, what his administration's policies will be, and so forth. So I don't think there's an immediate crisis of deterrence, but I do think it's something that will atrophy over time if we don't keep strengthening it. And I think there are two key lines of effort. Number one is we have to convince Xi of our resolve, of our commitment to defend Taiwan against unprovoked aggression, to stand up alongside allies like the Philippines and others. And I think the Trump administration will have some work to do, because on the campaign trail, Trump was very non-committal, even sounding kind of negative on the idea of defending Taiwan. So I think they have some work to do there. The second line of effort is in the capabilities area. And we've made a lot of great progress in recent years on posture, on deepening and strengthening alliance relationships with Japan, with Philippines, with Australia, partners like India. But a lot of our modernization is going to take many years to come to fruition and to be fielded in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a window in the next 5 years or so where we have got to focus on accelerating innovation adoption to take legacy systems and add new capabilities to them. Replicator is one example of that. But there are many, many other steps that we need to be taken. And I'm sure Admiral Paparo has a long list. I have a list. There are lots of people with lists that overlap on what are those most important capabilities to add to the mix so that we can maintain our confidence in deterrence.
Well, I'm going to get a quick serving suggestion on that list from you in a second, but your point about reputational deterrence is really interesting. I had a sort of historical flashback when you said that to 1941. In 1941, the German and Japanese high commands believed Roosevelt would fight. They believed the leader would fight. They didn't believe that the U.S. Congress would be fully supportive or ready because of all the divisive debates. By today's standards, perhaps even more divisive debates about America First and isolationism. I guess we're in a little bit of a mirror image today. Do you think that the resolve in Congress broadly and key institutions of government is pretty strong, and the question mark is really about what the president would say or do in a crisis? Is that a fair characterization?
I think there needs to be an education and dialogue effort with Congress. We have to help them understand why Taiwan matters, particularly in a world where TSMC is so dominant in terms of supplying most of the world's advanced chips. We need to help them understand the impact on the American economy, the global economy, if TSMC were taken offline or shipments of chips were disrupted for any significant period of time. I mean, the Council of Economic Advisors in the last administration did a study that said it would be a $2 trillion hit to the global economy and would probably send us into a global recession. I think probably a lot of Congress members haven't focused on this and may not understand that. And so beyond the arguments about we shouldn't tolerate a might makes right environment in Asia, we shouldn't tolerate unprovoked aggression to solve a problem or the dispute over Taiwan, but I think there's a very hard economic argument to make as well. And that I think we need to all do a better job on sort of really unpacking the case of why do we care about this little tiny island called Taiwan? Why is this important to American interests?
It's a pretty straightforward checklist right now, and probably more compelling than it's been in a while. There's the TSMC economic piece you mentioned. Successful coercion or absorption of Taiwan would put the PLA right on Japan's flank and cut off the most significant sea lanes in the world and isolate Australia and basically have the potential to completely upend the order in Asia.
Yeah, and they understand that, and it's part of why they are making such major investments in their own defense and really beefing up their alliance with us.
Japan, you mean?
Japan, but also look at AUKUS with Australia.
Yeah, Australia's a work in progress. I think the national security establishment understands very well what's at stake. I think the broader debate is not quite there yet. There's a line of argument that Taiwan's all about American pursuit of primacy and it's ideological. And I think the point about TSMC, about geography, about the alliance system, well understood in government by people like our friend Andrew Scheer and Greg Moriarty, but bit of a work in progress. If we could, to your shopping list, I guess, to your serving suggestion, you don't have to give every parameter and spec for every technology, but what are some of the areas? So you're okay with building on legacy platforms and getting new subsystems strike and so forth, but what are some of the areas you'd prioritize?
The first set of capabilities is to give us resilient and redundant command control communications targeting capability in the face of unprecedented electronic warfare attacks, cyber warfare attacks, possibly even attacks on space assets. So we've got to build a really resilient system. That is a work in progress, lots of things being done. And part of that has to be using AI appropriately and responsibly to sort information, separate the wheat from the chaff, and give us faster decision-making and decision-making advantage over China. So that's a whole bucket of things. The second is to buy back mass. And in the near term, in the midterm, and probably even in the long term, we're probably not going to fully match China ship by ship and so forth. So we have got to buy back mass by pairing manned platforms with unmanned platforms in the air, on the sea, under the sea. Give us buyback mass to greatly complicate their planning, their line of attack, their operations. Third is to buy back range for lethal strikes so that we can hold assets outside Chinese missile range and still fire long-range precision munitions from them to get to Chinese assets that are crossing the strait or what have you, to hold those at risk. And so really restocking munitions that have long range and precision should be top priority. And then I think continuing to evolve our posture to get more of our forces forward. Again, in the short term, I think it's more about fixing our very broken ship maintenance and repair systems so we have more of our ships that are already existing able to deploy forward. Over time, you'll see that fleet expand as new carriers and destroyers and submarines come on. And then lastly, I just double tap on our undersea advantage. It really is an area where we still have advantage, and we should play that to the hilt.
That's a transformational and not unachievable list of capabilities over the next 5 to 10, I guess in the case of undersea, 15 to 20 years.
You just need to focus. It needs some leadership and some buy-in from a team of people across multiple services and multiple functions.
So, for example, on command and control, there are huge AI-generated opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
What is interesting to me as a guy who focuses on alliances is these allow a common picture and
Mm-hmm.
decision-making algorithm, but the decision-making about use of force is still sovereign.
So you're all seeing the same thing and looking at the same choices, but you have your sovereign decision.
Exactly. In a region where we have a series of bilateral alliances, all with different authorities, different legislation, different levels of political support, we don't have to do what we did before World War II and have awkward meetings across the table with maps. You can leapfrog right to the common picture and, done well, give allies confidence in their sovereign decision-making authority.
And even have common picture at different levels of classification in terms of level of detail, and have Australia, who's a Five Eyes member, seeing one thing, and Philippines, who may be seeing something slightly different, but getting the same overall picture.
So can we get the services to do that as well, to have one common architecture?
Well, that's what I think is being worked. Something an early instantiation is Joint Fires Network, which is trying to create that at the Indo-PACOM level. But this is, each of the services has versions of this that they're working on. But at some point, it's not so much picking one system, it's having a set of standards for plug and play of different capabilities. So you have a common set of digital standards that allow different capabilities and sensors and software to plug in. The key that there are hard issues like, keeping custody of targets and making sure that as you plug in additional information, you can trust that information and its provenance and it's reliable and it's accurate. I'm not saying this is easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it is possible. From a technological point of view, we can get there in the next 5 years for sure.
And the buying back mass is also very achievable, and it's an area where allies have a significant contribution. Japan with robotics. Australia has incredible undersea autonomous vehicle capability because of the mining industry. So it's technologically achievable and something where allies and partners can plug in. But these smaller subsystems are not a typical Pentagon procurement project with a program of record and an iron kernel running it. Is the procurement system in the U.S. going to be up for generating the kind of mass we need?
Right now, these kinds of non-traditional systems, they have to be forced from the top, basically, as Replicator was. I think if we're going to get the system as a system to be more responsive and capable of moving with speed and scale to move innovative systems out into the force or non-traditional systems, you've got to change some incentives within the department. So you have to take a subset of the acquisition and contracting people and actually reward them for understanding how these commercial or dual-use technologies work and how it's different, moving with speed, using the flexible authorities like OTAs, other transaction authorities that Congress has given the department, but are grossly underused. Train people, incentivize them, promote them, reward them for actually moving in this direction much faster. But until we do that, it's going to be sort of lots of exceptions to the rule where you're forcing solutions down from the top, which is just limits the scale that you can get to and the speed that you can achieve.
And then forward posture. I mean, there are cases like Australia and Japan with the force posture initiatives, in Northern Australia and Western Australia with, the Japanese expanding access to the Southwest Islands and so forth, that are pretty explicit, that are based on law, where those governments are implicitly at least accepting more risk to support U.S. posture because it's in their interests to enhance deterrence in their neighborhood. So you have countries like that. Philippines would be a bit different, but trending in that direction right now. But a lot of access, not bases, but a lot of access, a lot of posture depends on much more ambiguous political arrangements and uncertain authorities and so forth. Do you think we can do what we need to do when we, the U.S. military and allies, are going to need access and posture where it's not always going to be guaranteed? It's a different way of thinking about contingency planning. The Pentagon, as you know well from leading these efforts, wants certainty. And the posture political environment we're looking at is going to have some areas of certainty, like Japan and Australia, or near certainty. It's pretty good with the Philippines, but uncertain. And then some areas where we're just going to not know.
It depends. It depends
Yeah, and
on
it
the
depends on the scenario,
situation,
it
the
depends on who's in
scenario.
charge in the country, it depends on whether or not the Chinese are bribing them. It's a different kind of game. Do you think we're up for that? It also, by the way, requires a State Department Pentagon synergy like we've not seen in a long time.
We're not there yet, but I think we could be and should be. From a planning perspective, you have to have a lot more contingencies within your contingencies, different plans with lots of different iterations depending on what combination of access were granted and what kind of time frame. But you're right that the State Department maybe hasn't had the opportunity to think this through fully. One of the things that I saw that was very powerful when we were in government, or this last time around in the Obama administration, was the power of very high level tabletop scenario based exercises to focus the mind. So we did a set of looked at the plans around Iran during the Obama administration when Israel was talking about getting very nervous about the state of their nuclear capability before the JICPOA agreement. And so we took a look, and it was a revelation to a lot of the non-DoD players around the table what would be expected of them in the ridiculous timeframes. Like, in the first 24 hours, we expect you to get access here, 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 and here. And in the second 24 hours, and people were just sort of deer in the headlights, like, oh my God, what? And so I think it's very important to have some mechanism for bringing interagency players together to make sure they understand their roles in these contingencies, that it's not just about deploying forces forward. There's a lot of machinery that has to kick in and work effectively and with speed for our response to be effective.
I think that's exactly right. I spent a lot of time with American diplomats in Asia, and I think that as a culture, the Foreign Service is ready to take this on for the most part. You don't find a lot of debate between state and defense about strategic competition with China anymore. You did a bit when I was in the Bush administration. I'm sure you did in the Obama administration. You don't find that. I think culturally there's a readiness. I don't think personally it'll work if U.S. ambassadors are handed a list of tasks. They're going to have to be empowered a little bit more in the planning. I know Goldwater Nichols makes that complicated, but they have to provide the context and the option.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but they need their own playbook. And it's just not a planning culture. The notion of, I think they tend to underestimate how much can be done beforehand to save you time for if the actual crisis happens.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are some who think if you plan for something, you're making it more likely to happen. And you got to break that culture a little bit. Allies need to be part of this, all of this, more than ever before. We are more, Phil Davidson had that line I liked. We're going from interoperability to interdependence. They're more dependent on us. We're more dependent on them. Let's talk about allies for a minute. I give the Biden administration very high marks for managing alliances and partnerships. Our friend Kurt Campbell, Mirarap Hooper, and others were created by the Lord to do this kind of work. They're good at it. But Trump people have a bit of a point that allies need to do a lot more. I wonder sometimes whether the Biden administration was a little bit too polite to our allies in terms of their own capabilities and effort to enhance deterrence. What's your take on where? I mean, I have no doubt the Trump team is going to be less polite. That's for sure. With allies, I think they'll be pretty committed to our allies. I'm not worried about Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz or whoever ends up at the Pentagon. But they are going to put more pressure on Australia, Japan, Korea to do more. And it's going to be more based on the contingency planning and therefore not subtle or gray. Is that right? Do you think there's a process question, but in terms of the problem, do you think allies in the region do have to step up more or be put more on the spot?
I mean, I think it's true that we've made probably more progress in recent years than in a long time, and that we all need to be doing even more, U.S. included, if we're going to be confident in deterrence and our ability to prevail if, for God forbid, there were a conflict. I also think you can't really generalize about allies. And when I think Trump talks most about burden sharing and his frustrations, it tends to be with the few, now relatively few NATO allies who are not, but they're allies and they're allies. So I think we have to be specific. But I think in the Indo-Pacific, all of us need to be continuing to step up and thinking about how we can do even more. I think bullying allies is probably not the most effective approach. I think treating them with respect, engaging them deeply and honestly, and helping them making the case that it's in their fundamental interests to do more, I think that's likely to be the most effective approach, as opposed to kind of pounding the table and bullying. Now, I'm not saying that's what the Trump administration will do. It depends on who we're talking about, but I think many of the people who've been appointed will be more sophisticated than that.
Yeah. I mean, part of reputational deterrence, which does matter, by the way, you're not suggesting that's a sort of superficial thing. It's real.
No, it's very, very real. And thank God it's real, because it's right now, it's saving our bacon.
And part of it is that our alliances are pretty solid. You don't see the way you did 25 years ago, the Chinese trying to wedge the US and Japan, for example. And you very rarely see it with Australia or the Philippines. Saw it a little bit with Australia recently with the election of Donald Trump. The Chinese made a bit of a play in the G20 and elsewhere to say Australia is a good friend of China, showing how to stand up to the US. Very embarrassing for the government here, which was not trying to strike that posture. So you can imagine a bullying stance would immediately prompt Beijing to sweep in. And it may not shake the government, but on the ground with public opinion, it could have an impact. So there's a definite blowback to reputational deterrence of overplaying this.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that one of the things that China that is really has to weigh heavily in Xi's calculus is understanding that if he were to move aggressively on a place like Taiwan, he's going to get a response not just from the US, but from others in the region. And I think that ability to build alliances that are really shoulder to shoulder in a crisis or conflict is something that we've demonstrated across our history, and he needs to continue to believe. And it's why I think that the outcome in Ukraine is not irrelevant to the Indo-Pacific, and that we've built this tremendous coalition to support Ukraine. If it all falls apart at the end, that's going to, I think, weigh in Xi's calculus as well. They made a good show of it for a while, but if we just wait them out, they'll fall apart in the end. I mean, it's just not a good narrative to feed into.
I'm pretty confident that the handful of people going into the Trump administration who did say we need to get out of Ukraine to deal with China, in their first meetings with their Japanese, Australian, Philippine, Singaporean, Taiwanese counterparts, the number one or two item they're going to hear is, we need you to prevail in Ukraine.
Right.
They're pretty clear about that. Let's talk a little bit about China's allies, such as they are. This axis of whatever we want to call it, I mean, let's be honest, it's more significant than I would have guessed 5 years ago. And I think you'd admit the same. Hal Brands and other historians have said it may be more significant than what Japan and Germany did to collaborate in World War II as Axis powers. I can imagine asymmetrical moves by one to support the other in a crisis that would significantly complicate our business. You already see North Korean troops on the ground. What's your take on what it means, what we can do about it, and how far it might go?
Well, I do think it is very significant, as you said. Initially, I thought maybe this is more of a marriage of convenience. And I do think there are differences of interest that could cause them not to cooperate on specific issues. But I think, the level of cooperation, having North Koreans show up in Ukraine to fight on the Russian side, in exchange, we assume, for some kind of technological assistance, defense assistance that they're going to get from Russia, to see the kind of support, surreptitious support that China has been providing, to see the open support that Iran has been providing and Russia to Iran. And it's sort of working in all directions. So I don't think it's going to be easy for us to drive wedges or break them apart. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try when there are opportunities, but I don't think we should assume we can just break this party up if we want to. So I think it's a new fixture that we have to think about. And it is one of the reasons why the argument that says we should only focus on Asia and get out of the Middle East, get out of Europe, not focus on anything else, doesn't work, because I firmly believe that if there is a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, Putin will almost certainly take advantage of that to make mischief somewhere on Russia's periphery. Same might be true with Iran once it recovers from its weakened state, if it recovers from its weakened state. So, we really have to see this as a collection of folks that have some incentives to cooperate with each other and to make trouble for us in in a second region when we're bogged down in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere.
So there's a small cottage industry of people in our business trying to come up with a wedge strategy. And it's usually a fool's errand, the idea that we would kind of forgive Putin in order to woo him away from Xi, or you hear sometimes people saying, if we can make a deal with North Korea, it's nuts. It's nuts. They have no interest. They would exploit it. I don't think the carrots work. What about the sticks? You think we could do more cost imposition for this alignment? I mean, I think you could argue that the Europeans have done this, that China's paying a price in its geopolitical and economic relationship with Europe because of its support for Russia. So it is happening almost organically in some ways. But do you think
Yes.
there's more cost imposition we can use to, frankly, not to break up the party, but to deter or dissuade one actor from exploiting another actor's confrontation with us?
I think there may be some more cost imposition we could do with China for its sort of secondary support, if you will, sending untold numbers of washing machines and refrigerators to Russia so they can strip out the chips and put them in military equipment. We should toughen up those measures to see if we can shift the calculus to say, hey, this isn't worth it. The challenge, as we all know, and we've already seen this with both the export controls that the last administration put in place and entities listings and so forth, that China has a lot of leverage over us. I mean, we spent 30 years integrating our economies, and they can hold critical minerals at risk. They can hold all kinds of things at risk in exchange. So there's no magic bullet here, but there certainly are ways that we can apply additional pressure.
One of the more challenging aspects of all this, which people don't usually talk about in the national security space, is we're mostly talking blue and red. We're mostly talking the U.S. and its close allies and partners, Russia, China, the Axis. But of course, there's that green, if you will, the vast expanse of countries. And in the Indo-Pacific, we're talking the Pacific Islands, the Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. It's a cliche to say it now, but don't want to choose for the most part.
Right.
We'll take development dollars or yen or renminbi where they can get them if the terms are right. Often don't have particular attachment to our priority on governance and democracy, are often sort of authoritarian states themselves, are very prone to propaganda about imperialism and sort of post-colonial memes, very prone. I think diplomats are often stunned how easily China and Russia and social media can sort of trigger the anti-colonial, anti-imperial sentiments in countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific and South Asia. So it's pretty tricky. And it's a bit of a regulator or a moderator on how much we accept risk. Quad's a good example. We should be doing more maritime security in the Quad. We should be demonstrating the capacity of these four major maritime democracies to complicate China's business. But every time we do it, you hear screams from Southeast Asia, from the non-alignment trained diplomats in Malaysia and Indonesia and elsewhere. It's pretty tricky. And it's not insignificant in a military scenario because elite capture or access for the PLA to Sri Lanka, the Maldives, the Pacific Islands would significantly complicate moves made by the US or Australia or others. Have you thought about this much? It's not a deterrence game. It's an influence game that's going to matter.
It's a competing for influence game.
Yeah. And in some ways, everything we've been talking about makes it a bit more complicated.
Yeah. No, it is. I think we have to compete more effectively. And we had a terrible own goal, if you will, abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, because I think that would have been a very powerful high standards trade agreement, and a powerful economic offering for the region and for our partners in the region. And we sort of left the field, let others fill the space. So that's unfortunate. We can't compete everywhere equally. I think this requires some strategic decision ranking, if you will, or prioritization of where does it really matter for us to have that influence if the balloon actually goes up, and then to focus on understanding how can we compete more effectively in that country. Is it saying, hey, we're going to make a special deal and bring you best American digital infrastructure, to get you into the world of AI, bring you into the 21st century in terms of the digital world? Is it something else that they need? But I mean, China, we can't throw as much cash at them. We can't bribe them the way, or nor should we, the way China does. But we do have areas of strength: American technology, American entrepreneurship, American support in other ways. We have to pick and choose where is it most important to really focus those resources rather than kind of a peanut butter spread across the region.
I think that's right. We have to be agile, and we have to have real unity of effort. Because if you leave it just to the State Department, every ambassador is going to say their country is that country. If you leave it just to the Pentagon, they're going to say wherever they were thinking of needing access, that's the country. You absolutely have to do it with key allies, particularly allies that provide development assistance, diplomacy, like Japan, Australia, Korea, which gets overlooked in this law, and the Europeans in many cases. And we've done it in recent years. I had Julie Chung on, our ambassador in Sri Lanka, an outstanding diplomat. And when Beijing wanted a home ported surveillance ship in Hambantota, the pretty much almost unused port they built in Sri Lanka, Julie and her Japanese counterparts, Development Finance Corporation, moved very quickly and put together a financing package, quite a bit of money for another port that was commercially viable. And, it was a bit like whack-a-mole, but the Chinese were rebuffed. Mm-hmm. And then they went to the Maldives and other places and showed up somewhere else trying to get that home port. So it's going to be, so you can say certain countries are important, but that.
Yeah. No, you do have to be agile. No, that's a good point. Yeah.
So you're right. You can't spread the peanut butter thin, but you got to be agile and you got to do it with allies. So back to my earlier point, I feel like culturally, the Pentagon, the State Department, Indo-PACOM, and a lot of our allies get that, but we haven't done it. And it's going to take work. And hopefully the Trump guys will get that.
You almost need a standing task force, not only interagency, but with key allies that's sort of watching and anticipating these Chinese moves and thinking about effective counters.
I've been advocating that for about 15 years. I think you're right. And it's not that hard to do. Michèle, this was great. Did you ever actually play chess?
When I was a kid. And I wasn't very good, but I did enjoy it.
I called this the Asia chessboard, but I'm a really lousy chess player. But this was masterful. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, great. A great conversation, and really hoping that we'll see some progress in these areas over the coming months.
I know people will be turning to you for ideas, so we got a good preview today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.